And Jinny, you can move forward. I'll talk a little bit about the Asana Ambassador Program. So if you're here, you most likely know about this program, but a couple of quick notes. For those that don't know, Asana in general is an absolutely lovely project management tool that I have found is really conducive to neurodivergent brains. So myself and our speaker today are both part of the Asana Ambassador Program. It's this community program, and we are both volunteers putting together content for just for the neurodivergent professional community. So if you are interested in learning more about either Asana or the Asana Ambassador Program, it's super easy to join, and they welcome all levels of familiarity. You don't have to necessarily be an Asana expert to be able to join. If you are just looking for more resources and to connect to a community that is focused around project management and organization, I'm dropping in the chat the link for the Asana Ambassador Program. I'll also be sharing these afterwards, so you'll be able to have all these. Jinny, if you could advance. And a fun new feature of the Asana in general program is that they have a forum where you can interact with other people that are using the Asana platform. And they recently introduced a neurodivergent tag into their forum space. So you can actually go and filter down any content that is tagged with neurodivergent. It's brand new, so it is a new space, but in there already, there's the recap from our previous event that I did. And then there's also this really cool message that Larry put in here that is talking about how to break down tasks even more if you don't have Asana AI, which not everyone has. Jinny, if you could advance. Before we introduce ourselves, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a quote from the Stanford Neurodiversity Project. Neurodiversity is a concept that regards individuals with differences in brain function and behavioral traits as part of normal variation in the human population. So as we move today through today's conversation, just remember that neurodivergence looks different for everyone. Not everyone believes in being diagnosed. Not everyone believes that they have a disability or a disorder. Your experience might not align with someone else's, and that is totally okay. This is a space for open minds, respectful learning, and shared growth. And anything that we say today is just advice from our own perspectives. But if you are feeling open, drop an emoji or react for us. Share some love to our presenter today. I'm going to introduce myself first. Jinny, you can forward it. So who am I? I am a award-winning marketing leader with 13 plus years of experience. I have recently been diagnosed with ADHD. I was diagnosed a couple of maybe 3 or 4 months ago. And a lot of things just started to make sense when that happened for me. And one of the biggest things that I wanted to do was to be able to talk about it. And so I wanted to create this space. I met the Asana ambassador leader of the program, and it just so happened that there was a overlap of being able to be project management oriented and being neurodivergent go hand in hand for success in the professional life. So being able to bring this community together, I am so excited. And if you want to reach me, feel free to use that QR code or that link. That goes to all of my information. It's my LinkedIn. It's getting more information about events like these. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, Jinny, today. Jinny is a lead data scientist with 11 years of experience in data science and engineering. As a lifelong introvert and neurodivergent individual, she's passionate about helping people navigate workplaces that often favor extroverts and neurotypicals. Again, this QR code here, and we'll share this in the chat later, will go to all of Jinny's information. So if you want to connect with her on LinkedIn, see more about her coaching services, or just see more information about her, check this link tree out here. And I'll let Jinny take it away from here. Thank you, Jinny, for being here today.
Thanks, Sam, for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
You're all good.
All right, great. Fun fact, I actually just got news that I am also getting a promotion to principal data scientist. So that technically won't be effective until next month, but I'll be able to update this slide pretty soon after that. So let's get into it. So let's go through our agenda and what we're talking about today. So first, we're going to go into understanding boundaries and then understanding what are boundaries, and then going into what are some of the specific challenges that we might have if we self-identified as introvert or neurodivergent, because sometimes it's not easy to just take that advice of just say no, right? Especially in the workplace, we might feel guilty. We might feel like we're not being a team player if we just say no outright. Then we'll go into some practical strategies. Namely, of course, this is also hosted by Asana. So I'll be talking about how you can use Asana as a tool to set boundaries in the workplace, as well as I have a script, a word for word script that you can use to set boundaries in the workplace. And then we'll talk about how do you continue your journey after this presentation, and then we'll go through a little Q&A and some takeaways at the end. I do also want to clarify that this presentation is mainly focused on setting boundaries in the workplace. I know there are also boundary setting strategies and techniques for your personal life, but this is more geared towards the workplace, because a lot of the strategies that I have don't always translate into personal life just because of the way relationships are structured a little bit differently with our coworkers versus with someone in our personal life, like in friendships or romantic relationships. Throughout this talk as well, I'll also be asking for some interaction with chat. And so the first one we'll go into is, what is a boundary? So for those that want to share, what do you think, or how do you define a boundary in the workplace? And stick it in chat if you want to. As we wait for some of those responses to come in. Oop, sorry, skipped around there. So what is the boundary? In general terms, I like to call this the lines that we draw for ourselves in terms of our level of comfort. So what you allow, especially in the workplace, you also encourage. And boundaries don't exist until you communicate them. A lot of the times people realize that they have boundaries, but they keep them internal. These are like internal boundaries. And then when someone violates them, you realize that boundary has been crossed, but that boundary also was not communicated to other people. Boundaries, they are meant to be shared. So if you have a boundary, don't just keep it to yourself. Please share them with other people. Let's look at some of the chat responses here. A boundary is a line that protects you and tells people how far they can come and act around you. Yes, exactly. Telling the CEO he can't sell a product if it's not set up right. Yes. I think of them as what I will or won't do. That's a great one. Yes, I'm going to say something I will do, not what I tell someone else to do or not necessarily to do. Okay, great. Those are great responses. So now that we have level set on what is a boundary, let's talk about why we want to set boundaries. So I know in the beginning when Zan was talking, she asked the audience, like, why did you attend? If you could also drop in the chat, why do you want to set boundaries in the workplace? If you are someone that kind of struggles with setting boundaries in the workplace, why do you want to set them? As those responses come in, we'll talk about some of the benefits. Of course, some of the most obvious ones is having a healthy work-life balance. By being able to set boundaries, you reduce the amount of stress, you reduce the chance of burnout, and you can increase your mental health wellness in the workplace. It also gives improved focus, so clarity and direction for both you and your employer. So if you're able to set proper boundaries in the workplace, it actually forces both you and your employer to focus on the work that actually matters. Too often I see people take on every request that comes their way, but not all of them are equal. Not all of them are important. Not all of them are impactful. And so by setting those boundaries, it actually forces the workplace to prioritize where you use your time and resource and energy and expertise. It also helps increase your self-worth. By setting a boundary, you're also communicating the value and worth of your work. Because essentially what you're saying is that I have this limitation, so let's be valuable about how I use my time, my energy, my resources, and my knowledge. And let's make sure that the expertise and the value that I bring to the workplace is applied in the best way possible. By setting boundaries, you're also showing yourself that you matter, right? It's not just telling other people, but it's also very important exercise to help tell yourself that you matter. And the last one, this is a non-exhaustive list. I'm sure there are other benefits as well, but it also helps create a sense of agency. It gives you autonomy and feeling like you have a say and control in your job. Too often I see people where they have their career or their job happen to them instead of them being in control of what they want and what they want to work on in their job or their career. All right, let's look at some of the responses here. Overwork, prevent burnout, yes. To be a better mom at home, yes, that's an important one because a lot of the times, especially when you don't set boundaries in the workplace, it can definitely bleed into your personal life. These are great responses in the chat here. That's awesome. The traditional advice out there when you just try to do a simple Google search and you say, okay, how do I set boundaries in the workplace? The typical advice is just say no. And the reason why that doesn't really work in the workplace is because if someone takes that advice and it works for them, great, that works for them. But a lot of the times for people, especially who are neurodivergent, they can't just say no. They have someone come in and they say, hey, can you put this presentation together for me? And you say no, right? That's probably not going to go very well in the workplace. And so the thing that actually stops us from saying no or even setting that boundary is our internal beliefs. So I want to talk about what are some of the internal beliefs that you have that stop us from setting boundaries. Again, please put them in chat. If any of these that I go through in the next slide resonate with you, just say in chat like, hey, yes, that one for sure. All right, so let's get through the list. Some of the internal beliefs is that you have difficulties in recognizing and enforcing due to masking or fear of rejection. So you feel like you need to look like a certain person or be a type of person in the workplace, right? You want to be helpful or you feel like you have to act a certain way in the workplace. Or maybe if you think that you set a boundary, you feel like you're going to get rejected from them in future opportunities, right? If you say no, or I can't do this, they might say, oh, I don't know if I want to work with this person. I don't know if I like this person as a person. This is actually really hard for people pleasers. The second one is balancing the desire to be helpful with the necessity of self-care. So a lot of people, they want to be helpful in the workplace, right? If someone asks them for help, you want to be seen as helpful. You want to help other people. You see them and they don't have the expertise that you might have. And you're like, yes, of course I want to help you. And they might be a good person. You like them. They're a good coworker. But then it gets to a point where you say yes too often. And now you're struggling with the desire of being helpful with your own self-care. Maybe you don't want to disappoint or hurt others by saying no. You don't want to be the source, maybe, of someone's disappointment by saying no. If they think they have a work request for you and they're like, hey, can you work on this? And you say no. And they're like, oh, okay, maybe we'll have to like move around a few things, or they're disappointed because they're not able to deliver this thing, then you might feel, we'll actually get to this, but you might actually feel guilty for being that source of disappointment. But in reality, you're not. You're actually just setting healthy boundaries. Maybe you don't want to be seen as an obstacle or incompetent. By saying no or putting a boundary in the workplace, you might be seen as someone who is getting in the way of accomplishing something at work, or maybe you think that other people think at work that you're saying no because maybe you don't know how to do it, or you're not good enough at time management, or you're not competent enough to like do this work quickly, right? This fear of judgment. Maybe you're also overcompensating for low self-esteem or low self-worth. These are people who might have imposter syndrome, and they think by saying yes to things, it actually compensates for them feeling like an imposter. Like, I don't belong here. I feel like I don't have the expertise. I feel like I have to do all this work to sort of prove why I am here. Maybe you want to stand out from others by taking extra work, right? Maybe you have in your idea that you feel like you should be progressing in your career in a certain way. You want to climb that ladder, and you want to stand out from others by saying yes and doing more work than other people. Perfectionism. So maybe again, you have, let's say, for example, five work things on your plate right now, and someone else asks for a sixth thing to add on to your plate. But the thing is, you maybe suffer from perfectionism in the sense where for all the six things now that are on your work plate, you want them all to be the highest quality of work. You only want to deliver the highest quality of work that you can, and you want it to be perfect. But by doing that, again, by not setting expectations or boundaries on any of those work requests, it starts to lead into burnout. Maybe you don't like conflict and you feel like if you set a boundary, now it's going to turn into some sort of argument and it's you against them, and you start getting into this like conflict. And, setting boundaries can be very hard for people who are conflict avoidant. And of course, the last one is very common for setting boundaries. They feel guilty for setting boundaries, right? Um, and then looking through the chat, someone said that what resonates with me, all of the above. So I'm really glad you're here today. So hopefully some of the things that I can give, some of the tactics can help you in that. So doing a little thing on the side here, I want to talk about when I was creating this presentation for this talk, I was thinking about why yes has actually become the default, especially in the workplace. And when I was thinking about this, for myself personally, and maybe a lot of you will resonate with this, I think it comes from two primary sources. One is your culture and your upbringing in your childhood. Of course, a lot of things come from childhood upbringing, and not being able to set healthy boundaries is, of course, one of them. And especially for myself, as someone who comes from an Asian immigrant family where the expectation is that you always listen to your elders. The elders are always right. Even though they might factually be wrong, it doesn't matter. What the eldest person thinks and what their opinion is, that's what you follow. That is what is right. And the second sort of factor that kind of conditioned us to use yes as a default is actually the school environment. So when you're going through school, you are the student and then there's a teacher. Whatever the teacher says, right? That's what you do. They dictate the homework, they dictate the lessons and the structures, and you ultimately have to follow them if you want to pass school. And this setting boundaries is actually very hard for those who were labeled as a good student, or maybe they were a high achiever during their education. And the thing is that this doesn't translate very well into the workplace, because with school, there's a very structured set of lessons that you go through, right? Week 1, you're learning how to do this. Week 2, you're doing this. And then at the very end, you go through some sort of final exam to test your knowledge. Whereas with work, it doesn't translate well because work never stops. So if someone at work is asking you to do something, that is never going to stop. Like, work requests coming your way, that's likely never going to stop. And so we have to learn how to set those healthy boundaries in the workplace. And the other thing with this talk is that I want you to break out of that default. All right, so let's get into some practical boundary setting strategies. So the first one we'll go through is, of course, Asana. So Asana is a work management tool. And of course, we should use it like that. And so if you have work requests coming in, then you want to use Asana or a tool like Asana as a work tracker. Maybe it's through a Kanban board or through some sort of list. And any work that comes my way, I want to make sure that it's in something visible like Asana to be able to capture all the work that I'm doing. The second thing is Asana actually has some neat features. One is time block integrations. What this does is you can actually integrate Asana with apps such as Google Calendar, Outlook, and Clockwise. And what this does is that you can actually, if you have some sort of work task in Asana, you can then tie that to a meeting invite for yourself in your calendar. And now that becomes something where it blocks off time for you to actually work on that specific task. The third thing is you can also use custom fields. Custom fields, you can put in things like estimated time. So when the work ticket or task is created, you can put in what the estimated time you think is going to be. And then just as important, you would also want to track the actual time it takes to do and complete that work. And this is very important because if this is the type of work that you think is going to come up again in the future or something even remotely similar to this type of work, you can now use this as a baseline on how to allocate time in the future for that work task. Similarly, you can do something like work effort. So instead of some sort of numerical value for estimated time or actual time, you can do some categorical value such as is this low effort, medium effort, or high effort work. And then the last one I'll talk about is something called workload feature. So this helps you manage capacity and rebalance work and also to plan ahead with Asana. So here I have a screenshot of what that workload view looks like. And it's a really neat way to take a high level look of the work that is actually happening with individuals on your team. So you see these purplish, bluish lines here going through, and that kind of tracks the amount of workload that each person has on your team. So if you are a PM and you use this workload function, you can get a high level view of, okay, if a new request comes in, who can take on this task? If only one person can take on this task because of their skill set and expertise, then if they are currently at capacity for the next couple days, let me take a look at what that work is that they have on their plate. And can I move or rebalance, shuffle that work around to get this other work request in, right? So it's a really neat feature to be able to have that high level overview on the things that you're working on. And if you're not a PM and you use Asana at work, I would highly encourage you to reach out to your PM if they're not using this workload feature and encourage them to use it to get a better understanding of what you might be working on. Where is that feature? This, I believe, is a premium product, premium tier of Asana. So I don't know what tier you might have, but I think it was, you have the basic tier and then 2 other tiers, I believe, after that. Oh, small business problems, yes. Yeah. But yeah, so this is pretty neat. Well, maybe once you grow your business, this is something that you can incorporate. I have premium. Can you tell me? Actually, if you go to the Asana website and you just type in workload, it actually this is where I got the screenshot from. You can actually find where you have to navigate to be able to create this view. All right, so now the second part of some of the practical strategies. So we're going to go into a script on how to say no at work. So why is it so hard to say no at work? Again, you might feel like you're being an obstacle, you're not a team player. And frankly, people don't like being told no, myself included, probably you as well. When you ask for something or you want something done, it doesn't really feel great if you get a no in response. So, how can we say no while still looking like a team player and come out of it feeling confident instead of guilty? And this is something that I've used many times in my career as well to help set boundaries. All right. So, in general, there are 5 steps to saying no. The first step, so let's say you get a work request and you already know that you can't fulfill what their ask is. The first thing you want to do is you want to acknowledge the request. So you say, okay, I understand that you want me to do some sort of analysis that gives you this sort of insight or output. And you just want to acknowledge the request to make sure that they feel like they're heard in terms of what they're asking of you. And like some people, I've been also looking at the chat. Sometimes when someone requests something of you, if you don't validate or acknowledge the request, you might have a different idea of what they're asking for, especially for perfectionists, where you think it has to be this like immediately polished output, finalized. Whereas they're just looking for, oh, we just need like something like quick and dirty. And so by acknowledging the request, it helps reduce that miscommunication in terms of what that final ask actually is. Step 2, you want to state what you wish you could do. If this is truly something that you cannot do, then you want to say, I want to give this my full attention. I want to make sure that I give this my best effort. And then it goes into step 3. You give a reason as to why you cannot fulfill that wish, right? I can't give it my full attention because I'm over capacity right now. Or I want to give this my best effort, but there is higher priority work that I need to focus on right now. And um, the thing that also helps with this is that you also want to be, this starts to bleed into other skills in the workplace, but you also want to make sure when you're giving these types of reasons that you also have buy-in from your manager or um, your project manager, your PM, to make sure that they are also in line with, okay, yes, we can't take this on because you are working on other priority things right now. Step 4, you want to offer solutions that make trade-offs. I love making trade-offs in the workplace. For example, you can say, I can do one out of these 3 things. If they are asking for different feature changes on something, right? As a data scientist, they're like, oh, I want you to change the logic, do all these different things. And I say, okay, maybe I can't do all of those things, but I can do one out of those 3 things. And you tell me which is most important to you. Maybe I offer them something like I can take a look at the scope of work. So sometimes when I get requests, especially from a non-technical person, they might think it's easier than it actually is to execute and deliver what they're asking for. So at least I offer them, hey, I can take a look at the potential scope of work. And a lot of times when I do this, I actually find that it's a lot more complex than that they were thinking. So then I say, hey, I looked into it. I looked at the data. I looked into what we currently have, what we're able to do. And it's actually more complicated because of X, Y, Z. And at that point, it helps to reframe what that output might be or reframe that conversation. Or you can also agree to deliver something that's not a fully fleshed out version. I can do a concept or a minimum viable product. And maybe that's good enough for them for now. And they're willing to take things in an iterative process. The thing is that what I found is that people would rather have some sort of progress or some sort of action happening than nothing happen at all. For example, if you if someone goes into the store, they look up some item online, it says it's in stock, they go into the store, it's not actually there. They go up to someone who works at the store and they say, "Hey, can you check the back?" Right? That's what they ask them to do. And if that store person, store staff says, "Oh, I already know it's not there." Right? That person, maybe if you're like nice, you're like, "Oh, okay, you accept that as an answer and you trust them." But a lot of people, other people, they want you to still physically go back there and check the stock in the bag. even if that worker actually did not do that. Maybe they just walked back there, waited a few minutes, and then walked back out and said, hey, there's actually nothing back there, right? And the thing is, when they do that, it gives the customer some sense that you have done something. I'm not saying that you should be doing empty work at work, but psychologically, people would rather see some sort of action. So this ties into, hey, look, I've spent a few hours looking at the scope of work. It kind of ties into that psychology. The other thing with the proof of concept or the minimum viable product is that I like to think of, especially for perfectionists, right? They tend to try to deliver what I call a 5-course meal to the requester. But instead, what I like to give them is an appetizer. I like to give them a little taste of what that final output might be, and that actually might be enough for them. And if there is a request that comes in, I always try to make the asker do some sort of work for me to determine if they actually believe that this is important for them or not to do that effort. And it could be even the smallest request, right? If they're asking me to put together some sort of analysis or model and I'm not familiar with the data, then I follow up and ask them, hey, can you get me where that data exists? Like, where does it exist today? And I give them just that tiny piece of work. And if they're able to come back to me and deliver that, then I know that they're serious about this request. Because there have been times in my career where people have come to me with ideas. They're just like this idea factory. They go to people and they're like, oh, can you do this? Can you do that? But then I actually do the work and I deliver it to them. And I find out in the end that they didn't actually use it. It didn't go anywhere. So all that work was wasted. So I always like them to do at least a little bit of effort on there. And if they're asking for something from me. Step 5, this is the final step. You can also reframe it with stretch goals. So again, if things go smoothly, then maybe I can work on the 2 things right after that. So it gives them a sense of hope. Again, this is like more of an iterative process. Instead of giving them everything at once, you're only giving them a little bit at a time. How do I handle pushback? So if you're afraid that you're going to get pushback by setting boundaries, there are actually 2 flavors of pushback that you can get. The first one being external pushback. And what do you do for that? I always like to lean on trade-offs. So and you follow through with consequences. So you want to be upfront on the potential consequences if you were to take on this work, right? You say that, hey, I can try to work on this, but because we only have 2 days instead of a week to work on this, there might be some mistakes that we haven't caught because we didn't give ourselves enough time to review the final output, right? And the thing here is that this can kind of change depending on the context. So if it's like a first time thing and it's just, oh, they didn't know about it until later on, and then now they're asking you for work. Okay, maybe it's like I have to have like a 1 strike rule where I give them some leeway the first time, but then after that, the second time and further on, I follow through with whatever consequence will happen if they don't follow my boundaries. So then I say, okay, maybe I can fit it in this time around, but next time I'm going to need 2 weeks notice instead of just 3 days notice to work on this type of work. The other kind of pushback, internal pushback. So in certain ways, this is actually harder to combat than external pushback. And so what do you do with that? It's actually quite similar to external pushback. And you make trade-offs. Again, sure. But now you're focusing on the long term. So what I want you to do is I want you to ask yourself, if you feel like you're having trouble setting boundaries and it's starting to affect the way you feel about work and it's bleeding into your personal life, ask yourself, what do I want my life to look like 3 years from now? You, by not being able to set boundaries and not making an effort to try and slowly change that, and it is going to be a slow process, what are the consequences in the long term for yourself, in your career and in your personal life? So again, you're making some sort of trade-off by not learning to build that skill of setting boundaries in the workplace. All right. So what now? You heard me talk for about a half an hour now. Okay. So what are the next steps from here? You learned all this interesting information. Now what? Continuing your journey. So the first thing, of course, is that learning these things and having that knowledge is one thing, but you have to practice. You have to practice it to be able to apply it to your real life. You want to be able to role play during low risk situations. So maybe that means asking a friend or your partner or a family member to say, hey, I had this thing happen at work. I was wondering if I could role play with you and maybe I can try practicing my skill of setting boundaries. Because the thing is, under duress, we don't rise to our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. And this is why practice is so important. The next thing you want to do is you also want to reflect. So when you're practicing setting those boundaries, reflect on how did it feel? What were you feeling in that moment when you were trying to set that boundary? And what were some of the thoughts and internal scripts, those stories that were running through your mind as you were trying to set those boundaries? Because your mind is intensely powerful and it hates change. And so when you're trying to do something new, like setting boundaries and something that you're not used to, it's going to try to convince you not to do it, right? So just pay attention to what are the things that you're telling yourself when you're trying to set that boundary. Because understanding yourself is a huge part in being able to make that change. And finally, boundary setting is just one skill, just one piece in terms of being able to navigate the workplace confidently. And it also overlaps with a lot of different other skills that you might need in the workplace, such as advocating for yourself, setting expectations, managing up, influencing others, negotiation, time management, and more. So, having said all of that, I am offering something called 30 for 30 coaching. So, what this is, it's $30 for 30 minutes of personal career coaching with myself. And this could look like going through a boundary. Maybe you want to role play saying that boundary with myself. We can go through that during these 30 minutes, or we could talk about anything else that you might have trouble with in the workplace. In the next slide, I'll have the QR code that links to my link tree, and there's a Ko-Fi page there. And if this is something that you're interested in, then you can go to that Ko-Fi page to get this type of service. My coaching is about giving you a sense of agency in your career, being able to feel confident, motivated, reduce the feeling of helplessness, increasing your emotional resilience, all while being authentic to yourself. Because a lot of the advice that I see out there when I've been trying to work through these skills in my own career is that a lot of it is tailored to those who are extroverted. And that's how the workplace environment is tailored for, right? It's mostly for those who are extroverted leaning. And the other thing is the boundary setting skill has actually helped me in my career for the last 4 years. 4 years ago, I started off as a senior data scientist. At that point, that's when I started really getting serious about experimenting with some of these career skills that I have, setting boundaries, managing up, all those things that were on the last slide. And 2 years later, I was able to be promoted to lead. And then 2 years after that, now I'm getting promoted to principal data scientist. And I was able to do all of that without hardly ever working more than the typical 8 hours a day. And each of those 4 years, I've also been able to take somewhere around 3 to 5 weeks of vacation from work as well. And I was able to do all of that because I was able to leverage and know this skill of setting boundaries and all the other things that I had listed on the previous slide. So at that point, that's when I said, I want to be able to have the skills to be able to control my career instead of my career controlling me. And so my normal rate for career coaching is $130 an hour, but because the Asana has been great about being able to let me talk about this topic and host me, this is a special service that I'm only offering to those that are in attendance for this talk. All right, and then with that, we'll go into Q&A. I think we have around 15 minutes or so.
Thank you so much, Jinny, for all of your advice here. I did get an interesting question in here. It wasn't necessarily focused as a question, but I thought it was really interesting. Ramona said that in county government, it doesn't always work to set boundaries because they are very politically driven in the department. And one of the questions I had for you is, when is it okay to flex on our boundaries and still be okay if we believe the boundary is going to benefit us in the long term?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the thing with boundaries is that it is highly individualized, right? The boundaries that I might have for myself in my career might be different from someone else. So the thing with this is, let's see, trade-offs would be great, but unfortunately, I'm in county government and it doesn't always work because things are politically driven in our department. So maybe trade-offs won't necessarily be I can only work on these two things and I can't work on this at all, right? Again, trade-offs could look like maybe you deliver something smaller that is more manageable for you and it just takes over a longer period of time, or maybe you reduce the scope of whatever they're asking for. Those are also trade-offs. I don't know if that helps, but oh, I see a follow-up here. I currently have 78 tasks in my task list. And I've told my team that I'm just putting things into Asana is very overwhelming at times. At this point, I think this also bleeds into having a conversation with your manager, right? Because at that point, if you have 78 tasks, none of them are important anymore, right? If they're saying all of these tasks are important, then none of them are important because you're not able to actually dedicate your time and resources to each of these tasks equally at a high quality level. And at that point, you would have to have that conversation with your managers to say, we need to talk about prioritizing this work so that I can actually deliver them in a high quality. And what can we actually put off? And that kind of goes into managing up, the skill of managing up as well. I'm glad that was helpful, Ramona. Yeah. Any other questions? I don't know if there's any other things that came up while I was talking during the presentation.
Yeah, I had one other question for you, Jinny. Just curious, what are some of the specific types of boundaries that you put into place? For me, it's hard to understand or know exactly what my boundaries are. I'm still trying to figure those out. So I'd love to hear from you an example of what you've put into place.
That's a great question. So, for example, for me, I knew I wanted to reach a certain level in my career and I wanted to get this promotion in 2 years, right? And so for me, I knew I only wanted to work on impactful projects. And because of the nature of my work, by working on those impactful projects, they're also inherently interesting projects, to me at least. And when other work requests have come through, such as I want to create a model that feeds into some churn analysis and we can reduce the amount of churn in our customers. That could be impactful, but I didn't really find doing that sort of churn model or churn analysis necessarily interesting. And so I was able to also look at other ideas that were floating around. And there were more interesting things such as I want to build a recommendation system to recommend products to our customers. That's something I found more interesting. And at that point, I had a conversation with my manager. I was like, hey, there are these like really big requests coming in for these like really interesting things that could be impactful for the business. But for me, I'm leaning towards the recommender system because I think it's something new that I can try, something new that I can learn. Excuse me. And I was able to say, but to be able to make sure that is giving really good results, I can only pick one out of the two. And what do you think? And so he gave his 2 cents, but he was like, I agree with you. I think there's more upside in the recommender system for the business. And especially if it's something that you're more interested in, then let's say no to the churn model. And actually what I did for that was I was like, hey, we can't do this, but I looked at some of the data. I only spent a few hours instead of if I had taken on the request, it would have taken months. I said, I looked at it. Here are my thoughts. Here is how I would approach it. Here's my thought process. You can take it or leave it. I don't care. I won't take it personally. And you can find out how to do that. And in the end, I actually found out that they had budget. They were like, oh, we actually have budget to engage with a third party vendor, and they can use the thoughts that I put together to give to that vendor to be able to put together that churn model. I don't know if that answered the question, but for me, I think the other thing for me is that I like to set very clear and upfront expectations. And when you do that, you actually find yourself having to set less boundaries. Boundaries sometimes is done after the fact, but if you do it proactively by setting great expectations, then you find yourself that you don't have to set those boundaries later on.
Oh, that's really interesting. I love that your boundaries is almost a after the fact situation where you have to someone has overstepped, but maybe you could have prevented that by setting clearer expectations up front. That could be a whole other 60-minute talk.
Absolutely.
But yes, I have more questions, but if the chat has any more questions, feel free to drop them in. One of the things I also wanted to bring up, because the question I asked you is like, how do you know what your boundaries are? And an idea I was thinking about was some of the things I see is that some people have like auto responders on their emails that say, hey, I only check my email between X and X time. So if you need me, message me on Slack, or sets that expectation about how to get in touch with them, and also sets that expectations around boundaries in general and how you want to be communicated with. Have you ever instituted any sort of boundary around your email or messaging? Do you respond after hours? How do you handle those types of conversations?
I actually have not had to institute any sort of automation, even though I have gotten emails and messages through chat after hours. The thing is that for me, I might look at them, but I won't respond to it until business hours. So I actually think of it as by not responding to it after hours, right when the message comes through, I'm almost like training the other person to not expect me to respond right after they have sent me a message. Good. So thankfully I haven't had to do that, but I know some other people can be more pushy. And the thing is that by the other thing is that when people message you after hours, the person on the receiving end sometimes, again, has this internal belief that they have to respond right after, even though the person who sent the message did not expect him to respond immediately. Maybe especially when you're in asynchronous work environments, you might be in different time zones. Even I have sent messages to other people, and I've said in the end, I was like, hey, can you look at this? I know it's outside of business hours, so I don't expect you to look at it right now. You can look at it either tomorrow, whenever you get back to work. So I like to set that expectation whenever I participate in that kind of behavior. And I don't assume that they expect me to follow up immediately, so I don't.
That makes sense. And that's a really good point, which is how do we make sure that we're creating a healthier workplace in general and being able to say, make it explicit. Hey, I don't expect you to respond to this, actually will help you to have that treatment back.
And the other great
Yeah.
thing too, to add on to that, is that now there are functions like in Teams where you can right click the send button and you can schedule it to send at a certain time as well.
Yeah, that's true. I do that a lot. I definitely do the scheduling a lot. As far as what we've gone through before, I think I wanted to highlight one of the other things I saw in the chat. Case did have to drop, or Casey, I'm sorry, don't know how to pronounce their name just yet, but I will get clarification on that. And they said, I just realized that if I push myself past my boundary for fear of disappointing them, it's likely I'll disappoint them anyway by not being able to complete the task or help as needed. How What advice do you have for people that are worried about disappointing others? Is there any sort of practices they can put into place to start to experiment with the saying no?
Yeah, that is a very good point. And there are two things that I want to mention with that is that some people actually would rather deal with the discomfort of someone violating your boundary than dealing with the discomfort of actually setting that boundary because of that fear of disappointment, feeling guilty. And it's something that you need to be aware of if you do feel that way. The second thing I would do for that is to think of boundaries. The thing with that is that there's an inherent assumption almost that setting boundaries is always a negative thing, right? It's always a bad thing to do for the receiver. But actually, I found that setting appropriate boundaries actually helps not just you, but also the person you're setting the boundary with. For example, when I can't do this like fully fleshed out like thing that they want in terms of whatever request they're asking me of, and I say, okay, I can do a smaller minimum viable product or proof of concept for you and do it in a bite-sized chunk in an iterative process. What it actually does is it helps them bring them along throughout the process. So I give them, let's say, what I call the small appetizer. And after I deliver it to them, I say, hey, what's your feedback? And they can actually have input. And there might be things that come out of it that were unexpected and it changes the direction of what they were originally asking for anyways. So by setting that boundary, saying, hey, I can't do the whole thing. I can only do a small part. It actually might benefit the work that you are doing and actually might benefit the other person because now they feel like it's more a collaborative process. They're part of it. They can give their feedback and input and they're like, oh, this isn't quite what I was looking for. Let's change it a little bit. So that's the other thing I would say is that to reframe boundary setting is not just a negative thing for the party on the receiving end. It can actually be a positive thing as well.
That's a really good point. And it's part of that creating that healthier workplace too, and being able to push past the norms of yes is the default and making sure to everyone track in the same direction. So we have time for one more question if anyone wants to drop that into the chat. Otherwise, I'll close this out and start to talk a little bit about our next event that we're having, which is open for registration. I'll give it just a second to see if anyone drops any questions in. Okay, you were really clear about things. You set very clear expectations on what you were going to
No
provide.
questions.
Yes. No, but anyway, thank you everyone for coming. We have the next event coming up. It will be March 26th, and it's going to be on inbox management. The registration is up now. It is in my link tree. So feel free to go to that to register. These events are unfortunately only limited to 100 seats. So make sure to register early because if you register, you'll be able to have access to it because they do sell out and they sell out real quick. And this got posted a couple of weeks ago, or no, sorry, last week. So I want to say thank you again to Jinny. I think I learned so much, which is really starting to implement the boundaries so that I can take care of myself, being able to start to think about what are the boundaries that I need to protect myself in the workplace and to be able to show myself the respect that is there. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you being a part of this. And make sure to reach out to Jinny. She has a lot of information on that link tree, and that 30 for 30 coaching is discounted for just us, the masterminds community at Asana. So thank you everyone for coming. It's really my pleasure to be a part of this community and to be able to bring this to everyone. Thank you so much. We'll just stay on for a little bit more. If you have any questions as people drop off, feel free to come off mute, ask those questions. I'm actually going to stop recording